Here we are. So this way I can make sure I remember them all. The first was, here we are. So this way I can make sure I remember them all. The first was, we said that the British, look at You've now got, gentlemen with the architectural glasses, and you've now got a bigger share than I'm going to get for the whole thing, so that you get the real plaudits. So we do a lot of work for community groups, where we help them set up an alternative master plan, and now increasingly we're doing this for developers and landowners as well. Hang on, I'm just going to go back a couple of things. This is a development we did in West London, where we always set the top on that we have to match the development density of the landowner when we work for community groups. So we're not making things up here, this is real. And as you can see from the example on the right, we tend to get, well, we always get, massively more local support for our development, our proposals. We're very interested in data, so we've created a tool called Street Score, where we take the big data on streets, height, facades, homes, density, design, urban blocks, land use, space, greenery, air quality, and we can then use that, gosh, this is a bit tricky, to come up with a quantitative measure of the quality of a street pattern. And we can then use that to predict house prices or index of multiple deprivation. Sorry, I'm standing in front of you, I'm sorry. My technology in hands will just run out if I don't. So we can now score the quality of streets. So just to give you an example, so I'm going back a little bit here, but I will speed up again. This is scored by the computer at 36. 100 is the max, 0 is the minimum. Now, at one level, that's quite a nice place. It's got lots of trees. But would you like to hang out there? No, of course you wouldn't. And so the computer's getting that right. So this is not scored by any human. This is getting a 70. It's not perfect, it's a bit too much parking, but it's a better place to hang out. You've got some nice variety in a pattern, you've got some greenery, you've got access to local greenery. So we've come up with an algorithm which is quite a good predictor, it is becoming a good mathematical predictor of the quality of a place. So we're very interested in the data. I'm not a designer, I come from a banking and a consultancy background, an academic background. We're interested in what people like and where they want to be. We're not interested in the design process per se. I mean, we are interested, obviously. So I'll jump over all this. This is the sort of stuff we do. We're interested in regulation. Boom, 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 boom. So this is my first question. This is something important I missed out. Sorry, in my memory, I missed this one. I'm going to talk to this one minute. Then we will catch up with where we are. Is this making sense? You sure? Okay, thank you. This is something I missed out, which I should have said. Over the last 80 years, we've got some things. I mean, the world's got much better in many ways over the last century. Here are some things we've got importantly wrong about the way that we design and use our town and city centres. First of all, we got very confused about the role of cars. When cars were invented, back in the 1920s or 30s, they promised enormous freedom. Think of the image of the young man in the 1920s pooting around in his open car in the empty roads. It was a thing of freedom, and we assumed that therefore meant it needed to go in the town or city centre. And town planners desecrated towns, smashing highways through to get that freedom to the town centre. Got it profoundly wrong. We're fixing that now. That was the first thing that went wrong. The second one was we just got able to build much bigger, blander, cheaper, big boxes with no features on them as a function of technology. The third thing we got wrong was that modernists rejected both the traditional street pattern. Le Corbusier said the street is disgusting, why therefore do we not destroy the street? He said it in French, he wrote it in French to be honest, and also rejected the traditional facade pattern. Not that facades shouldn't evolve. Cost of labour post-World War I meant it meant much harder to do more finely grained design. And finally, quite rightly, modernists were worried about the amount of greenery in traditional towns, but failed to realise and imagine actually how easy it is to layer in street trees or pocket parks or squares into traditional development pattern. So these were things we traditionally got wrong, I think, over much of the last century. Some of these we're now beginning to put right. And certainly in the UK, I think on some things, not all, we're at a potential inflection point. And what Create Streets is trying to do is help inflect on that. And I'd certainly urge you to try and do the same. There's some absolute horrors being built in Oslo, based on what I saw yesterday, and you should check them. Right. The other bit of context I forgot to mention, which I understand may be of interest to some of you, is the 2011 Localism Act. This was have any of you heard of a man called David Cameron? Remember him? He was Prime Minister for a while before he had a very successful referendum campaign. So this is a quote from him back in the glory days of his youth. The time has come to disperse power more widely in Britain today. And the Localism Act 2011 is actually quite an important piece of legislation. It's not entirely worked, because nothing in this world does entirely work, but it has done some important things. The key thing it's done is introduced this concept, I'm not going to talk about these, but this concept of neighbourhood planning. Now, I'm not going to give all the detail on this because I'm not going to give you a long lecture on British planning process, but in a nutshell, what that does is allow very local communities to write the local plan for their area. There are some constraints on that, but that means they're starting to set planning policy. So that's quite an important step that's happened, which is influencing development patterns in the UK. It's not perfect, but all sorts of interest. If you want to talk about that further, ask me questions or come and talk to me afterwards. But I think for those of you interested in planning policy in Norway, I think there are some interesting lessons to be learned from that. Right. Oh, I missed this. Beauty used to be something we talked about without embarrassment. So this lady here, Octavia Hill, was a very important lady in British history. She was behind a lot of the revolutionary social housing in the late 19th century, and also was key in setting up the National Trust, which is a very important British institution. She talked unashamedly of the importance of beauty in the housing that she was providing, and that had legislative consequences. Here are the aims of the 1909 Planning Act, which used the word, sorry, I apologise for standing in front of you. I'm afraid you've chosen the wrong seat if you don't want to be stood in front. Now she used that quite happily. Now you can see here that I've got two which look the same. See, the tricks don't work on PDF. Fast forward 100 years, and the lady who until recently was head of the National Trust, and I'm not reading it all out to you, but says quite rightly, we're just too ashamed to talk about beauty when we talk about the built environment. It feels somehow shameful or not technical or specific. And ironically, people in the world and wider world happily reach for the word beauty. It's the high professions and the high officials who somehow regarded as elitists to talk about beauty. So this is the paradox that to some degree the commission that I now help chair was set up, I think, to try and resolve. So that was the bit I missed, sorry about that. And I think now this is the bit I did talk to, so that's what we're trying to do. That's who we are, boom, 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 boom. We've done this bit. Right, this is literally where I've got to. So I'm going to come back to this if I get the time, but one thing I will just say quickly now, this has been relevant to us, human preferences are important, and what we don't like and what we do like is incredibly predictable. There is an issue of taste and local preferences, but most of our preferences for built form, which has got a sense of place, which has variety in a pattern and a human scale density, is very clear. Again, this won't quite work. So this is what this place looks like now. I'm going to show you two images, and this is what it's proposed to look like. Hands up if you prefer this one. And hands up if you prefer that one. I thought you'd say that, because that's what people around the world do. There is a clear preference in what most of us like. And that would be true of almost all audiences, not quite all, I'll come back to that. The other thing is we can use data about the city to predict where people walk more, where they know more of their neighbours, where they tend to feel more of a sense of control over their environment. I'll come into this in more detail later if I have the time, but issues such as connectivity, density, nature and size of greenery, home type, facade pattern, size of urban blocks, and whether they're true blocks with clear backs and fronts, mix of land use, height of buildings, nature of public and private space and the design of buildings. All of these, as the data on cities gets better and better, the data certainly for English cities and above all for London is incredibly good. So we literally know where almost every street tree is. We know the age of buildings in every street. We can map these things incredibly confidently, and we can use these to do correlation analysis with index of multiple deprivation, with how many neighbours. So there's incredibly strong data, and I would certainly urge those of you involved with Norwegian politics or academia to start looking at what it is you can do or use that you're not doing already. I'm sure you're doing marvellous things. Here's the images I was going to show. So this is a very recent development. It's literally from last year in London, which I think it's beautiful. And here's another one in Cornwall. This is again is very new. So the British system is, we are still able to create beauty. We have the skills, we just don't do it. Those are the three levels, and here are the recommendations I was starting to talk about. So just quickly, I will now run through this quite quickly because otherwise I will be giving you too much detail on British planning. But these are the recommendations we're making to the British government, which they have responded to quite warmly. And what me and my fellow commissioners are doing between now and the end of the year is working these up in more detail. If you want more, if you Google the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission, you can get you can get the full thing. This is printed 4-to-a-side, double-sided, and there's appendices too. So if you're having trouble sleeping, I particularly recommend the appendices, which will really cure your insomnia. Ask for beauty. So what we've argued is that at a national level, the National Planning Policy Framework, which is the overarching document in England, should say that beauty should be an aim of what we design. But Second point, what that means is something that needs to be defined locally. Clearly you can't define beauty in an existential way, just like you can't define truth or goodness. These are qualities we aspire to rather than things we can always measure. But the type of development pattern that works in this city, or that works in London, or that works in Oslo, or that works in Winchester, or that works in Paris, or that works in Toulouse, are things you can start to define, and that we should do that. I'm going to jump through some of these. Another key argument we're making is that the nature of the tax system and the nature of the planning system in the UK, by bringing public consultation early into the process, should preference what we're calling placemaking rather than house building. And that mixed use, by which I mean a mix of housing. Well, is this interesting, or am I just rabbiting on? Is this okay? Yeah. You look bored. Are you okay? Sure. Okay. If you want to sleep, that room is very comfy. But that a mix of uses, and that places that, as this town does, that feel like real places, should be what we aspire to do. And the rare issues, which I won't go into now, about the way in which the UK system makes that hard to achieve. And then, hang on, let me just pull out a few more of these. Another one that I just obviously don't know which of these are relevant in Norway. What we're suggesting is that the planning system in the UK should actually aspire to a net gain. Either development makes a place better. The moment all it says is it shouldn't make it worse. Which again, if you think about it, is a remarkably modest aspiration. If you think of, if I think of the places I most like, they have beautiful buildings in them as well as beautiful landscape. And that should be our aspiration. I'm going to jump over this one. I'll touch on because it might be relevant here. In the UK, there's a vast amount of what I call box land, by which I mean an enormous box, which either has a big drive-to shop or a big drive-to company or office in it. That's a very inefficient bit of land use. Now, you may not be under the same pressures of density that we're under in England, and above all in the southeast of England, but that you can actually take those boxes, and I saw loads of them as I drove here from Oslo, and reinvent them as bits of town or city, which still have the same retail or commercial space in, but you just squeeze it up, you make it a little bit higher, you put housing there as well, you make it a real place. Now that may not be what you always want to do alongside a motorway, but that a lot of this box land, certainly in London or nearby, could actually turn into real places, and that the value of the land, if you do that, is massively higher. So it is something you can make happen. I want to jump over those which I think are not quite well. This one I will touch on. We talk about a concept which we call gentle density. So there are advantages to low density, advantages of space and access to private or communal green space, but there are also advantages of density. We tend to walk more in denser areas, we tend to know more of our neighbours. Gentle density, this is gentle density around us now, where you get some of the advantages of both, is what should be an explicit aim of what we aspire to develop. Biodiversity is another thing where we're saying, there is clearly a biodiversity crisis, and we should be aspiring to make our developments actually increase biodiversity in terms of trees that are planted or space that's created. And I'll just say two more things, then I'll jump on to my next question. This is very important. Thanks to these things. And thanks to massively reducing costs on visualization of proposals, it's getting increasingly easy and cheap to interact with lots of people on what sort of development they want to see. The planning system in the UK is actually in some places getting much better at that, but it's still way off where it could be in IT terms. And I'm sure, I suspect the same is true here. So how can we get developments, options, ideas brought forward into the process and understood, shared online, voted on, responded, allow people even to change them online. This type of stuff is getting increasingly easy to do and can fit in very well with the co-design process, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. So that, I think, is another area. If we involve the public more widely in what we produce and how we produce it, you tend to get better and more popular development. And I will, I think, stop there because the rest is a little bit UK specific. Is this vaguely interesting still? Should I keep going? Okay. Because if not, the door's there, I guess. Sorry, I have missed one. No, keep going, you see, it's not interesting. We're all looking at you. The other key one is I think, where is it? It's, where is it? There we are, education. So we haven't gone into detail on this yet, but we're very, very concerned, based on the feedback we had in the UK, that too many involved in the planning development process don't understand all the data about the correlations between design and well-being. We're also concerned that some of the history of our towns and cities and how they worked is not understood by many people who it should. So that's an area we also want to get into. Right, I think that's it. The key surprising thing is, I think to everyone's surprise, again, I'm not going to read these at you, we actually got a very warm response from all the powers that be in the UK, from the planning and architects. And you can see some of the quotes here, and there are some of the quotes on the next page. And I think it's fair to say that if that had happened 6 months, if you'd been told that 6 months ago, that no one would have believed that. This was a commission that was very, very widely criticised by the professions when it was set up. So, obviously, we're pleased about that, but we think and hope that sets a good place to work forward in trying to lead to better outcomes. But that doesn't mean we've got fixed everything. So this beauty has literally, I think on Monday, it might have been last week on Friday, has just received planning permission in central London. It's lovely, as you can see, and that breaks literally every rule about good urbanism. Now, it's an extractor sort of ventilation shaft for a new underground railway, but that in no way is an excuse for such an abhorrent building. I don't for a moment pretend we're getting everything right. There's an absolute horrors that are being commissioned. This maybe is the inspiration. This was in a satirical film we were hoping to show you, but can't due to IT problems. We've had a couple of those. This was used in a satirical film of an above-ground basement. I'm not sure which you think is better. That, which has just received permission, or the satirical film about the above-ground basement. I don't know. Anyway, that's the first. The second thing, so just trying to pull a few of those themes together which might be relevant for you, and obviously that needs to be your call. How can government promote popular design and more support for development patterns and development? And I think the first thing is to stop thinking of design as a soft subject, as an art subject, and actually start measuring what people like and where they flourish. And that you can do. This is just an output we've used from a recent book called The Streets and Squares. So that would be my first piece of advice to those of you involved with government at the national, local levels or trying to influence them, is to measure what people like and measure where people thrive and flourish. Measure well-being and link it to urban design and city format, because you can do that. That might be my first bit of advice. My second bit of advice is you'll see how this is reflecting the work of the Commission, is to ask for beauty and good design very firmly in the government development pattern, but allow it to be discovered locally through co-design rather than consultation. And I saw you had the hierarchy of needs there, which I half understood. This is actually a co-design session we ran last year in South London, and local residents can do this. People are very, very good intuitively at understanding where they want to be, what they like, what feels safe. I find a really good question, I apologise to the younger people in the audience, but one that works particularly well with parents is to say, where would you be happy your child being? Because most of us, care much more viscerally about our children than we do actually for ourselves. It's a really good way of getting to them all. By co-design I mean, and we were talking about this earlier, that you allow professionals who have necessary expertise and residents and other local stakeholders to work together to find the right answer within a framework of what's economically and physically viable. And that's something you can do at different levels of complexity and detail depending on the scale of the development. Again, I could go into more detail on that. Consultation, as you can see from the cartoon on the side, is a very easily faked process. So that would be my second piece of advice, is encourage and set up a framework where developers and landowners are incentivised to use that process. They know that if they do that and can show they've done that, they're more likely to be able to build things. And there's an example of actually a rather good master plan that was done by residents working with us last year. It's also very easy, again thanks to online polling, to understand what type of building pattern people want to see developed. So this was for a mixed-use scheme we were doing polling on, and these were the ones that people most wanted. And actually, these are the more popular types, but there were lots of other types that they rejected. And you can get data on this. This doesn't have to be just in subjective design. This can be objective use of data. The third point I'd make, and this actually reflects how we built, certainly in Britain and much of Europe. I don't know about this with Norway, is regulate consistently with predictable parameters which support gentle density. So don't have a random planning process that can be gamed by people with deep pockets, but just set clear rules about what's acceptable, hopefully indicated strongly by local preferences, and then just work to these. And that's actually how we built towns and cities for millennia. There's a bit of a myth in the UK, I don't know if it's true here, which is that planning is a post-war sort of socialist creation, and that is absolute rubbish. Literally the earliest cities that we've got evidence of, back in northeast, northwest India or in the Mesopotamian Delta, have very clear evidence that land use patterns and block patterns were in some way centrally regulated. Of course they were, because that's what happens in cities. That's the nature of the city. We've got excellent evidence from the Roman Empire, and I know this from London very well. London has been a heavily regulated built environment always. That's my stop, time to go. And the reason is, if I own one house and I put up cities, I thatch it and it burns down, I destroy your house. So there are externalities here that government has to regulate. So regulate in a consistent way that is aligned to patterns. Don't make it a gameable system. That'd be my third bit of advice. Jump over that. Anyway, that's what I was just talking about. So this is the reason. If any of you've spent time in London or British cities, you'll recognise those houses. That's what you see in the town centre in London. And that isn't because everyone just woke up one morning and said, oh, I know, I'll design a house like that. It was because that's what the regulation essentially allowed them to build easily. It wasn't some sort of free market nirvana beforehand. When those go wrong, or when the regulation gets gamed, you get the horrors of early 19th century housing, when the existing urban form was over-squashed by the fact that people now needed to work in new factories. But then there was a response to that. A series of legislation in the UK, the 1848, 58 and 75 Public Health Acts, essentially created the need to build what we now call by-law housing, this type of terraced housing that is common across much of Midlands and Northern England. Now, it's not perfect. They don't have squares in them and greenery, which they should have. But actually, that was a massive improvement in the living conditions prior to the court that you saw in the earlier image. And that solved a lot of the life expectancy and health issues associated with urban living, though there remained issues with water quality and cholera, but that's another story. So that's what we should be creating: beautiful, gentle density. That's my second point. Another group of people just left. How much longer should I go on for? How much longer? Have I got another few more minutes? Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
You sure? Okay.
Yeah.
Not lost the will to live yet. Okay. Say if you lose the will to live. Right now, this is my. So there is one more. Sorry, there is one more of. That side was in the wrong place. What would you think if I asked you what would be reminiscent of the structural rhythms and forms of the Gothic Cathedral of Notre Dame? Would you think of that? Is that reminiscent? Is that reminiscent of the structural form of Notre Dame? No, of course it's not. A 5-year-old could tell you that's bonkers. And yet the people who are proposing this for the Pavillon de Notre Dame have proposed it in that was a quote. They proposed in exactly those terms. And this goes to my point about education. Actually, I wrote a piece about this the other day. There's architecture has become in many ways an academic discipline, very cerebral, lots of philosophy, lots of thought in it, which leads to architects being able to say that is consistent with the structural rhythms of Notre Dame, which is clearly insane. And architecture and design needs to be both simultaneously practical. As you probably know, architecture comes from the Greek architectron, which means master builder. If you go back 100 years, architecture was something that was learned mainly as an apprentice, and you were the project manager. You were the master builder. You run the process. The engineers or everyone else reported into you. Certainly in the UK, and I understand in much of the world, architecture has been squeezed down into sort of something that gets brought in at the beginning of the process. And I realise, I don't know if there are architects in the room, but architects need to go back to being master builders, the project managers controlling the process, and not so interested in the, if you like, the academic fairy tales that leads to that sort of rubbish. And I'm not talking about the building here, I'm actually just talking about the description of building. Simultaneously, if you are going to be an academic, it should be a hard discipline with numbers and facts about those links between design and well-being. More of if you like, an empirical discipline, and less than what you might call a scholastic discipline. So that's that. So that was my second question. My third question, which I understand is relevant in the debate in Norway today, is about design and density and sustainability, by which I mean primarily energy usage. Now, I'm not going to talk about, in a way, the key point, which I'm just going to assume you all know, but the key point is there's very strong evidence that when we live in denser neighbourhoods and communities, we use less energy. Because we use cars less, that's the key reason. We use public transport, walking, cycling more. That's being used at one level correctly to make the case for denser development. But it doesn't follow from that any dense development is therefore always more sustainable than another way of doing the same density, or indeed possibly a slightly gentler density. The first point is about how long buildings last. Do you remember I showed you that air vent that's just got planning permission? And it's been defended by its defenders in its ugliness because of its form. This is a power station. It's a power station whose use has changed. I could show you another half dozen pictures of power stations or industrial buildings in Britain who are still in use 50, 100, 200 years later because they are things of beauty. And when their function has changed, because functions do change, I don't think this room is being used in the way it was first planned to be used 200 years ago, whenever it was built. The building survives because people wish it to survive. The embedded carbon in a Victorian brick house in England would drive a car around the world 10 times. Keeping buildings and reinventing them and reusing them is a deeply sustainable thing to do. And to do that, we need to build beautifully so people just wish to to recycle the buildings, if you like. Here's another example, not one of enormous energy importance. In the 1980s, British Telecom, bless them, got rid of all of these, or got rid of as many as they could, and replaced them with beauties such as this. Now, as you may have noticed, we will have these now. So we don't need telephone kiosks. These have literally all gone. I don't believe there are any of them left in Britain. They've also been chucked away. No one cares. Astonishingly, these, because they got saved, some got listed, and they're coming back. And people are turning them into libraries, or into defibrillators, or into coffee shops, because they are things of beauty, which actually start to have an existential meaning. I don't know about you, but that defines something to me about the elegance of British life under the law in my country. And that has actual emotional resonance for me. I look at that and I can feel emotion. Not so much. And no, I wouldn't say the energy importance there, but I'm making a point about sustainability here, linked to the appearance of form. Now, the other point about energy I want to make is about high-rise and density. I have a slide later. Sorry, I keep going the wrong way. I'm doing something very old to my thing, I think. There we go. I'm getting into trouble down here. You'll remember the point I made about high density places being more sustainable, which is true, but there are different ways of delivering the same density. There are now two very robust studies, one from Hong Kong and one from London, done by Professor Philip Steadman, who I know well, looking at the energy usage of high-rise. These two charts show, hang on, which is which, these are actually both office buildings, but there's a similar pattern for residential buildings. As the height increases, the energy usage per square metre goes up, the higher buildings get. There are good reasons for that. The main is wind. It is not protected by the surrounding streets. So the energy usage to cool it or heat it goes up, and also usage patterns seem to change. You obviously need lifts more. People seem to behave slightly differently in very big buildings in terms of lights being left on and other things. If you go to a similar density pattern in what I call fine grain, I've got some images of that later, by which I mean buildings more tightly packed together, the buildings are actually sheltering each other. We were talking about Nansleden earlier, the developer actually showed you an image of in Cornwall. At the moment they can't plant trees in this new development on the Cornish coast because it's too windswept, the trees would die. Once they've built the first probably 500 or so houses, they can start planting trees because the buildings will protect the trees. We're creating a microclimate. So people who argue for dense developments for sustainable reasons are right, but they are importantly incompletely right. The nature of the density, the nature of the development, and indeed the beauty of it has a profound consequence on the long-term sustainability. That's the sort of the third point I wanted to make. I've got a fourth point. Can I go on to make that? You okay? Okay. My watch is broken, so I don't have a watch. So I don't know how long I'm going on. But this will be my last. This will be my last one. So, what types of places are good for you and why? I've been sort of touching on this a bit already. This man, David Halpern, who's a very influential psychologist, didn't become an architect because he was so frustrated by the lack of data on which buildings people like to be in and streets and why. The good news is that 20 years on, that concern is no longer relevant. Some of you who may have seen me ask this question before, what proportion of health might be derived from your environment? Pick a number. Do you reckon it's 0%, 100, 50, 20? What do you think it is? You don't know. What do you think it is? No idea. Okay, everyone put up your hands, please. Everyone put up your hands, please. Okay, I'm going to go down from 100. No, hands up. All of you. Yes, you as well, and you. Okay, I'm going to go down from 100 to 0. 100% is a function of your built environment, of your health. 80%. Take it down when you think the number's right. 50. 30. Okay, most of you are right. It's about 40% probably. And that's a function of the air quality, how much we walk, how stressed out, how in control we feel, our blood pressure. So it matters, this stuff. I'm going to jump over that. Again, a couple of people have seen these slides before. Developers in the UK use the language of traditional urbanism, but that doesn't mean they always mean the same thing. So the developers of this beauty call it Vauxhall Gardens, but that's a garden. It's not a garden. Just calling it a garden. So I'm sorry, I'm in front of the company. I apologise. This one, and again, a couple of you may have seen this. Calling something a square doesn't make it a square. And again, I checked this with my 6-year-old. He's not 6 anymore. That's called Malaysia Square, but it's not. There's a reason the developers give it this language. Calling something a village doesn't make it a village. Calling it human scale doesn't make it human scale. There's a reason that the architect of this calls it human scale, because he realises that people instinctively aspire to that. This is my new favourite. Actually, I got to use this in Venice earlier this year. Calling a tower the Canaletto does not make it the Canal Grande. And the deep irony is that we know from the behavioural science that people who live in towers tend to actually retreat from the city more, particularly as this luxury tower does, when it comes with its gym and its cafe and its this, that and the other. People use local services less. The towers can be a good place to live in many ways, but they tend not to be things that lead to your interacting with the local streets environment. So there's a deep irony in the use of that. I'm going to go off a couple more slides and then I will stop. What time is it? Because I just want to check I'm not going on too long. Yeah, I'm going to stop in about 3 minutes. Will that be about right? Okay. So I touched on that earlier. I'm just going to pull out a couple of examples, just to give you a sense of the data richness. More street trees on a city street is reliably associated with better health outcomes for people who live on that street. Now, whether that's causation or whether that's correlation, you can argue about for a long time. And what I'm going to say, perhaps rather perverse, is I don't think it matters. Because either it's causing the better health, or people with more money who are better able to game the system are buying it on that because it makes them feel happier. So either way, I think you lead to the same conclusion, which is that street trees tend to be a good thing. You can't get street trees in every street, but you can when you should. Views of water are associated with value. I'm going to jump over this. I just want to jump to one thing. Where is it? Here we are. I was going to do this. So we just published a book earlier this year called Streets and Squares. And most of our books are probably need to buy, but this one is available free for download, so you can download this from our website. We looked at the types of streets and squares that people prefer to be in and why. And we did lots of polling, but we also looked at real data on real cities. Places you find attractive, good for your mental health and pro-social behaviour. Facades should live and have variety in a pattern. So they need to repeat and rhyme. As you walk past them, they need to be things that are similar and different. Some facade complexity is good, but not too much. You need coherence. So as you approach the facade, as you walk away, it has some level of detail. Colour is nice. I noticed that you're good with colour here. And people seem to prefer some symmetry in their facades. Now, those are all empirical statements. Those aren't me just saying that. Those are the types of buildings and street patterns people seem to prefer. I'll give you one bit of evidence and then I will stop. I just want to, this is some polling we've done, I'm going to jump over. I'll just show you this, then I'll stop. So this is some polling we did with Mori, who are a British polling agency, which is an international polling agency. And we were very, very strict with ourselves. So we tried to control the images as much as possible. We've also done polling based on, I'm going to show you one more slide after this. This is one data point we used. So we controlled the number of people, we made sure the sky colour was the same, there's a reliable number, predictable number of trees, or consistent number of trees, and then asked where would you rather be? And we tended to get very, very predictable responses. So the more variety in a pattern, more colourful, stronger sense of places were consistently preferred by strong majorities in our 2,000 people survey. So this is getting, what that's getting? That's getting 60 or so percent, and this is getting 20 or so percent. And that's consistently what we got. The other thing we did was we used Google Street View. Hang on, you jump down to something else now. Hang on, this is the evidence on symmetry and colour. We used Google Street View to drop an algorithm we helped develop with an academic into about 19,000 streets and squares. And we then could score, this is an algorithm that predicts people's responses to an image, and is scored on about 2 million images, and it basically gets it right. And we then took the scores and related them back to what was actually, what's actually in the picture, which we can do from the big data in terms of age of buildings, height, presence of street trees. Just to give you confidence, these are the types of places it scores low. So those aren't places you want to hang out in for the most part. And those are the sort of places it scores highly. So what we found, hang on, where's the thing? Hang on, where is it? I'm sorry, I can't find it now. Oh, I've killed the main slide. I've taken out the main slide, so you're just going to have to trust me on this. But what we found was that places with variety in a pattern, slightly older buildings, more walkable, with some greenery, but not necessarily huge expanses of greenery, and with a variety of use types and a rich variety of uses of the area, where you have this type of pattern, were consistently preferred. Street trees, interestingly, though they're good things, weren't a predictor of better places, because lots of bad places do have street trees as well. So I'll leave it there, I think, because otherwise I've gone for too long. But my key message would be that design is not just an art. In fact, it's not even primarily an art. Where people are happy is something we can now start to measure and predict, and that we should start to measure and predict. And thank you very much for listening. Thank you.